Del Mar, but now she lives in New York City. So it's going to be a little harder to get her to come, I guess, probably in the future. But she's done several really wonderful talks for us in the past, always on a very timely subject. I remember right after Donald Trump got elected, she came and talked with us about authoritarian rulers.
And Andor too.
Yeah, and Andor too. And I think before that, you had gone on a trip to maybe Argentina.
Was it Argentina?
Or Venezuela maybe, and you talked about the film The Tape, about production, worker-owned production, and I think Andor and Teresa did that together.
I got that one.
And then, most recently, it was just about 2 years ago, you had spent a year in Vietnam, and Andor and Teresa came and talked about Vietnam. That was a wonderful talk as well. So we feel really, really lucky to have you back here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And for people that don't know, Teresa is a retired, at this point, Florence B. Sherwood Professor of History and Culture at Union College. And in her spare time, she wrote this book, We Don't Become Refugees by Choice, about Mia Truskier. And this was a friend of yours as well, right? Must have been a long-term project.
Yeah.
So I'll let Teresa take it from here. After she talks for about a half an hour or so, then we'll do questions. Okay?
Thank you. There's a lot. There's a lot to this woman's life, and there are many different spin-offs from it. And so I'm going to try to keep to, for a half an hour, I will explain sort of the broad outlines of what she told me. And then we'll take questions, which can, hopefully fill in some of the gaps. Now, I knew Mia Truskier, and I got to know her actually through Andor. She was her son, and the young woman became her daughter-in-law, Mary. Peter and Mary were friends of Andor's from Long Beach, and then later on at Berkeley. And so I met Mia, I think in 1975, and I would see it along with her husband, Jan. And then I saw them over the years when Mia and Jan, when we would go out to California to visit, particularly Andor's family in Los Angeles. They were living in Long Beach then. And then later on they moved to the Bay Area, to Northern California. And I'll explain some of the reasons for that. Jan died, and then for years we went to see Mia. And I would always talk to her and about her life a little bit. And then I was working on a book that I haven't gotten to, and maybe will at some point, I don't know, or some series of articles, about the North American solidarity movement with the struggle in Central America in the 1980s and 1970s to the 1990s. And it was when I was working on that, I would talk to Mia, and she was quite she was living in Berkeley then. She was in her late 80s at that time, and she died at 94. And so I would talk to her about it, and she would always tell me about her work at the East Bay Sanctuary Covenant, which was in Berkeley. It's one of the most important and the largest sanctuary and advocacy groups. Some of you I'll explain a little bit about that later. They were the sanctuary that brought the suit against Trump to stop the confinement of the children at the border. And we're really in the forefront. So that was what she was a part of. I became interested then in Mia, and she started to tell me about her life and about being a refugee. And I asked Mia why she did all this work for refugees and she said, and all of her activism until she was very old, and she said, I will never forget what it was like to be a refugee. And there's something about her that I think is important, is that she was an activist for refugees. She was not an activist for any specific group, although I would say she became most involved with Haitian refugees, and that was one of the reasons she was specifically working with. But mostly it was Central America and people from Haiti. She did not become an advocate. She was never a Zionist. She never became an advocate for people who were like her from the Second World War. She looked for her activism was focused on the refugees of the current period. And I think what's important about her is that she drew together the two main eras of refugees. 1940s, after the Second World War, which was the implementation of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. It was then when the world and a world body became concerned with how to process refugees, because previous to that time, although the big waves of that refugees came after the First World War, it was during that time that it was recognized that this was not a problem that could be handled by private, by individual countries, by churches, by organizations. It was a worldwide problem, and it fell under the auspices of the United Nations as the United Nations formed. Okay, Mia was born in 1920 in Warsaw, and she died in 2014. This is just tells a bit about her time as refugee. She came to the United States on a Red Cross passport, and she was a displaced person. I don't know that this is able to read, but in 1949, she and her husband, dear sir or madam, and they got this letter from the Displaced Persons Commission of Washington, saying that she was to, they were supposed to turn in updates as to how they were doing when they got to the United States. I don't know whether they ever did that or not. This is a picture of Mia in the in her later years, probably. And one of the things I always think about when I look at this is that she had a remarkable head of hair. And I remember one time I was talking with her, and I said, and she said, you know, I sort of worry, I don't want to outlive my teeth. And then she said, I don't want to outlive my hair. But, you know, now all I worry about is not outliving my money. So, and I think that's probably the universal. And she is here at a table, the annual fair, Christmas fair of the East Bay Sanctuary. And I talked to her a lot about why, as a Polish Jew, she got involved with an organization that was founded by churches. And there is kind of a long story that she had in relationship to that. Okay, she is, as I said, she worked for Haitian Relief, and this was a poster. You might see this sometimes. It's in a lot of calendars. It's in the Syracuse workers' calendars. It's been out and around. It's in the Oakland County Museum. She created this poster in 1997, and it was after the major hurricane there that had stripped the land of a lot of vegetation, and it's really quite beautiful. She had a special place for Haiti. Okay, she told me about her life. She said that her father, Zygmunt Plusty, her name was Plusty, T-L-U-S-T-Y, and in Polish you say it like Plusty, rather than Plusty as we would probably pronounce it. Her father was born in 1895 in Warsaw, and at that time it was part of the Russian Empire, Poland was part of the Russian Empire. He came from, as she said, a well-educated Jewish family, was assimilated into the Polish Gentile culture. When he was a little boy, his family celebrated Christmas and had a traditional Christmas tree. His mother, my grandmother, Genia, kept up this tradition after her husband, Maritzi, died. I remember as a little girl the excitement of visiting her at Christmas and gathering around a huge tree decorated with candies and all kinds of candles and all kinds of beautiful glass ornaments and cookies, baked in different shapes and candies. I only vaguely remember Grandpa Maritzi. I think I was only 4 when he died. I know that he used to own a stock exchange business. Okay, that particular quote, which is one of those that with which I began this study, tells a lot about Mia's background. She came from what we would probably see as an upper middle class background. Her parents, her father was trained as a doctor, but then worked for a long time with her father, Mia's father, his father-in-law, in a retail business in Warsaw before. They lived on Nowogrodzki Street, which was right near the center of the city. And Mia grew up in an apartment in a building that her parents owned. So that gives you a sense of, the kind of background that she came from. One of the things that Mia was could get quite agitated about was the view that people had of Poland and Poles as being very poor and very uneducated and sort of kind of a view that they were that there was nothing sophisticated about Warsaw. And actually, Warsaw was a quite developed city. It had more telephones than Paris before 1940. It had a major streetcar line and some of the best universities and schools. Another thing about Warsaw and about Mia is that she always identified as being Polish. In fact, I didn't know, and her own son did not know until he was about 12 years old or so, I think, that they were Jewish. She just always identified as being Polish. I found this extremely strange because someone who left Poland in 1940, one assumed was Jewish, and they had to escape. And she spoke only Polish. Some members of her family spoke Russian because Russia had colonized Poland until the end of the First World War. And she said she spoke Russian because a lot of their servants in the house girls, they would come from the countryside and they spoke Russian. But she never really spoke Russian. And she only spoke Polish. But one of the things that's important about that in our conception of Poland is that, as some of the historians have noted, when Hitler got to Poland, or when the Nazis got to Poland, they did Warsaw. They really did. They were totally shocked because they couldn't tell who was Jewish and who was not Jewish, because of the high level of secular Jews and because so many Poles spoke Polish. By the time of the Second World War, in the city itself, most Jews spoke Polish. Some spoke with an accent, and that was a giveaway as to being Jewish. But for the most part, the language of enterprise was Polish, and Poland had a quite good public school system. This was the main square of pre-war Warsaw, and it was completely leveled. It is, has anybody here been to Warsaw? What's really remarkable is you can go back, and it looks pretty much like that. The level of rebuilding that the Poles did after the Second World War is truly remarkable. They have artisans in Poland who redid these buildings so that if you go today to Main Square, it looks very much as it did before the war. However, after the war, it was completely and totally leveled. I first became aware of the skill of Polish artisans because when I taught at Union College, they were redoing the Knott Memorial, and some of you may know this huge round building that's in the center of Union's campus. And in order to redo the glass and the brickwork on it, they brought artisans from Poland. We had them there on campus, and these guys have only spoke Polish, because they were the ones who still had the skill to do that kind of artisanal work. They had a house in the country, in this area called Josephso. This is a picture of her father, her mother, Mia here, and her brother Tajus. And this is a picture of Mia and Tajus. And she talked a lot about how it was very nice to be out into the country. They lived not very far from the city. And so this, once again, was kind of a mark of a very middle class and quite, very prosperous background. Her mother didn't work outside the home, although she was a contributor to one of the major magazines in the city. It's often referred to as the New Yorker of Warsaw at the time. And she wrote articles for that from time to time. And when I went to the Poland, to the museum, there's a huge museum of Jews in Poland, the history of Jews in Poland, and this Literati Warwaki is called, is there. And they had a lot of contributors. They were all men. And I thought that was really strange because I knew that this woman had contributed to it. So I have to, see about getting that corrected at some point. Okay, she confronted anti-Semitism, and I talked to her a bit about that. And I thought that I would play this for you, and you get a sense of not only what she sounded like, but also her view on this.
I mean, the church was very anti-Semitic. And the church, they were telling children that the Jews killed Jesus. I think I told you about it.
What kind of contact would you have with Catholics in Poland?
Oh, I had a lot of friends.
Mm-hmm.
Most of my friends were Catholics.
Mm-hmm.
In school,
Did you ever feel any anti-Semitism from them?
No.
What did, how did you know about what the priests would say about the Jews in Poland?
How would I know?
Yeah, would they publish this
Well,
stuff?
they were
stories?
talking about it, They were talking, I mean, it was, I remember one time I went with my mother to buy something at a little store. I mean, I think they were selling food, some, pastries and things like that. And my mother asked about something, and he said, oh, this is very good. It's not some kind of a Jewish stuff. Just like that.
Uh-huh. He didn't know she was Jewish.
Oh, no.
Uh-huh.
Okay, that is actually something that is in the book, and it has, I've talked about it at various times, and some people find it rather hard to believe that there were so many Poles so many Jewish Poles who did pass as Aryan. And there's been recent investigation into that, and we know that a large number of them survived the war. Staying in Warsaw and hiding out, they were called the hidden Jews. Okay, in her last year of high school, she applied to study at the architecture school, and she was denied. And for Mia, who had grown up quite protected, this was a great shock, because it was the first time that she really confronted anti-Semitism, and she knew that she didn't get in because of the quota. And what she did then was she went to the Federal University of Technology in Zurich, and she tells us about going to that school.
Just going back a bit, why did you decide to go to the architecture school in Switzerland? Were there any other options besides, other countries?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, as I was telling you, one of my friends went to Vienna, and there were some people that I knew went to Prague. But my father was very wise, and he said, if I let you go abroad, then I want to make sure that she will be in a safe place. Already at that time, and that was a couple of years before he died. But he said, I don't want to send, for example, when he will be safe.
Okay. So that's interesting. So you got to know.
And besides, it was also like the best school of that kind in Europe. It was, like MIT, it was an excellent federal institute.
It is actually the 10th best university in the world. So Mia left Warsaw and went to this when she was 19 years old. And she got there and she had to pass all kinds of examinations. What she accomplished was truly remarkable. And we know this university is its most esteemed graduate is Einstein. But the classes were sometimes in German and sometimes in French. And you never knew what it was going to be. The professor would walk into the room and would simply lecture whatever language he wanted. And so she was really a very, very smart person, and that she got into the school. Now, it was there that she met her brother. She met her husband, Jan. And Jan came from a very wealthy family, the fourth wealthiest family of Poland, actually, at the time. And they were Jewish, too. And this is Adolf Truskier over here on the left. And he was one of the only senators in the Polish Senate at the time of the war. And this is her mother, Regina, who escaped from Poland with them. She always liked to be pictured in front of her car. Mia did not like her mother-in-law. One of the few times that she started to yell with me was when I said, when did Regina die? And she said, she lived with us until 1968. She came to California with him. She did not like this woman at all. And Regina never acclimated to not having the cars and the wealth. Okay, the war changed everything. And this is what happened at the time of the war. The Jews were rounded up and sent to the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, Mia and her family did not go to the ghetto initially. Her mother never went. Her mother stayed managing the building, and until Mia and her husband and Regina, her mother-in-law, and her cousin left in April of 1940. So they stayed throughout that time, and the major danger was the bombing of the city. And her father left, and her father went to adhere to the call-up, which was for people to go to fight against the Germans. So her father was troubled about this, but he was a Polish patriot. And he said that he had to take up arms against the invasion of the Germans. So you get a sense of what this family, how this family identified. He left, he never got, Mia never saw him again. He was picked up and then sent to a Soviet work camp in Siberia. All the Poles who were in that part after the invasion, after the Soviet Union invaded Poland, and he and her brother ended up there, and he died in Kazakhstan. And her brother survived the war and was a doctor and worked with the Red Cross, and then eventually settled in England after the war was over. Her mother did not either leave with Mia, nor did she go with her husband. She stayed in Warsaw, and she worked with her brother-in-law, and she was a, quote, hidden Jew. She never put on the star. She simply lived finding different places to hide, and she worked with her brother-in-law making false identity papers, which he would then take into the ghetto and help people who could pass to leave. And she has a lot of story about that, which I take up in the book. Okay, Mia left and she went to Italy. Oh no, what happened first? Mia and Jan got married. They got married in a Catholic church. They had forged papers and they got married in the Catholic church. And there's a very large number of conversions to Catholicism that occur in November and December of 1939. Catholic Church in Poland became much more popular all at once. And so that meant that there were a large number of priests who were carrying out these marriages. And where she was married was right here. Her mother then worked with the secretary of this church. And her mother's name was Paulina. She worked with the secretary, and that was where they made the false identity papers. They would go through the rolls and find old baptismal records, because in Poland they didn't have any birth certificates. They had baptismal records, and some people had birth certificates, but most people, almost everybody, was Catholic. And that's where she worked. So Mia then, you know, always talked about this double-edged sword, that she knew it well in the Catholic Church, that it was the most anti-Semitic institution she had ever encountered, and very, very strong anti-Semitism among many Catholics. But also there were those who worked with the resistance. What Mia did was she and her husband went to Rome, and I'm really going way too long on this. They got to Rome on they bought a Bulgarian visa on the black market in Warsaw. And that visa wasn't good for anything, certainly not Bulgaria. But they got this forged visa, and they got it to Italy. And through various machinations, they tried to get into Switzerland, and they were turned down there. And they went into Italy because the Bulgarian visa wasn't good for going anywhere, particularly not Bulgaria. However, it was good to trade for a 24-hour transit visa in Italy. They got that transit visa for 24 hours. Through various things, they made it to Rome, and they stayed until 1949. So they stayed throughout the war in Rome, basically passing as Polish Christians. And Mia worked there under the table without work permits, and she made Christmas trees and nativity creches because she was a very skilled artisan. And I said, Mia, don't you think that's really funny that you're a Polish Jew hiding out in Italy, making your living, selling on the black market, through the undermarket, these very high-end Christmas trees and nativity creches. And she just looked at me and she said, well, I don't know, we make Christmas in Poland, Christmas trees, big Christmas trees. We didn't have nativity creches, but And the reason that she made that was because she was quite skilled, because poor people didn't have any money. There was nothing that they had to sell. Only rich people had money. And so she got into making not only these things, she ended up making costumes, centerpieces for very high-end, fascist celebrations. She made a wig for a costume party. She did a whole Marie Antoinette outfit for someone. She thought these things were absolutely absurd. But if they paid her, she made them. And they lived throughout the war that way. And had this son, Andy, who was born in 1943. And I'll be talking about him a little bit later. This is one of the things, through various things they worked, and she purchased identity papers. And this one is, as I said, this is for her husband. It says that he is Polish, it's all Italian. It's back like, they bought it from the Chilean embassy in Rome, who for some reason was selling these. And a lot of the embassies kind of got into trouble, particularly South American embassies, because they were Catholic and without a doubt. And then here at the bottom it says that he is of ethnic background of Polish, and he is of the Aryan race. So it was with this identity paper that they purchased that they were then able to get some better working papers and some place to live. They did take, Rome was under fascist occupation. However, all of the embassies were in the Vatican. They stayed. And they did work with people in the Vatican, going in with artists, and got messages which were then passed through the underground to the resistance in Poland. So there was always this kind of underground work that was going on there. And this is a picture of Mia and her husband Jan and their son Andy, and then Richard was a cousin who came with him, and Mia Truskier, and they are, I just like the picture. It really, this was probably right before they left. Okay, where were they going to go? Well, they weren't going back to Poland because Poland was destroyed. Jan went back to see if there was anything, and there he found some of his relatives who had ridden out the war in Warsaw. Mia's mother left as soon as the Soviets were ready to come into the city, and she walked with thousands of other people, and she walked to Rome to be with Mia. There was nothing to go back to. Obviously, they didn't have any houses or anything, and so they went back to Italy. They stayed in Italy, and they were trying to get visas to come to the United States. And she had many stories about who got visas, and they knew somebody there who got a visa, was right at the head of the line, and they knew that that was a Polish informer who was with the Gestapo. But for some reason, he got a visa to the United States ahead of everybody else. So there were all kinds of stories that she had about who got the visa. They got a visa to go to Lincoln, Nebraska, and that was a world of difference from this whole life in Rome and, of course, in Poland. And they stayed there for several years. She liked Nebraska, and it was in Lincoln. It was kind of a university town. She worked as got a job as an artist and a designer for shopping, for department stores. That was becoming a very big thing in the post-war world. They stayed there for a while and they moved on to Long Beach because Jan had very bad hay fever and asthma, and he was then able to work as an architect. He had an architecture degree from this very prestigious university in Switzerland, but he was never able to practice in Italy, although he did at the end after he got some of his papers. So this is where Mia becomes an activist. Her son, at her memorial service, I think, says it the best when he talks about her activism, which begins when their time in office in Long Beach. This is the thing that most impresses me when I think back on my mother's life. The fact that her experience during the war made her more, not less, able to embrace the common humanity of all people, and that she felt compelled to act on it. And so that is really kind of what is most remarkable about her. Okay, how did the activism, I would say they were always quite progressive, but the activism came because their son, Andy Truskier, was at the University of California at Berkeley, and he was a very important activist in the free speech movement and in the 60s movement. And he kind of brought Mia and Jan into more activism, although they were quite supportive of him. Andy was in the Red family with Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda and that crowd. And he also went with Eldridge Cleaver to the Soviet Union, to North Korea, to China, and to North Vietnam in he died in 76, so it was in about early 69 or so. I have a thing here. So he was not only active, he was very important. And at his memorial service, which he died in 1976 of leukemia, some thought that maybe all the smelling of toxins and things when Mia was doing a lot of this work, artistic work to make a living, and they had to live in this place that was very, very poorly ventilated, almost no air because they didn't go out that much, that maybe that had affected him. But anyway, he died in 1976, and they had a memorial service. And at the memorial service, everyone spoke. Hayden spoke. Holly Deere did the music. Jane Fonda spoke. Everyone spoke about how important Andy had been in the anti-war movement. As a result of his importance in the anti-war movement, and also that he went to Vietnam, Mia and Jan got involved. One of the first refugee groups that they became involved with were Vietnamese anti-war refugees. So there were Vietnamese who were brought to the United States in 1968 as a part of the Vietnamization plan, and they were sent to California universities and they were to learn the American way, but most of them came and they got a large number of them got converted to the anti-war movement. When they became converted to the anti-war movement, they lost their visas. So this man who teaches now at NYU was one of the founders of the Union of Vietnamese in the U.S. And he wrote that they questioned U.S. policy and that one of them was extradited in 1972, landed at Tan Son Nhut Airport outside Saigon, and was assassinated when he got off the plane. So in 1972, the Tan Son Nhut Airport was very much controlled by the South Vietnamese and U.S. forces. Basically, the United States, they argue, this group of Vietnamese students, should set a date to withdraw all the troops, that the internal affairs of Vietnam should be resolved by the Vietnamese, and that they should adhere to the 14-point peace program. As a result of this, the United States government took these students and they took away their passports and they became stateless within the United States. So they had no place to go. They certainly could not go back to Vietnam where they would probably be killed. But some of them were pursued in the United States as well. And that is one of the first things that where Mia got involved in supporting refugees, and that is that they took the Vietnamese students who were endangered in the United States, in Southern California, and they would entertain them at their house. They didn't live with them, but they did entertain them. And I interviewed this guy who has a funny story about how he got to NYU, but he's the head of the Agent Orange, the compensation for victims of anything in the United States. So he said that they would go to see Mia and Jan because they could talk to them about things and they could never talk to their own parents about any of their anti-war activities. And those of you who maybe have read The Sympathizer or seen the work of Nguyen Viet Thanh Nguyen, he's written a lot of things about being an anti-war Vietnamese. Okay, so then it was there that she became involved with the sanctuary movement. And that was after Andy died, they moved to the Bay Area, and she became involved in the sanctuary movement. She did, there she is with her poster, with Sister Maureen Bligan, who's one of the heads of the sanctuary movement there. She did this mural that is there as you enter. And the thing, until she died in 2014, she was on the board of the East Bay Sanctuary. And as I said, she had moved from being housing Vietnamese and then Haitians and working with Central Americans and everyone. And she said, I will never sit by when there are people who are in need, refugees who are in need. And that's sort of what impelled her. She, I think, is an important figure because she brings together the two main eras of refugees, the 1940s and the current period. And in the current period today, refugees the world of refugees is, a situation that is far more dire. According to the International Organization for Migration, it is projected that 1.5 billion people will be forced to leave their homeland by 2050 for reasons of climate change alone. They might not necessarily leave their home country, but they would leave their home. And the place that has one of the largest number of refugees in the world today is Turkey, and it's followed by Colombia. And Colombia is kind of interesting because there's such millions of refugees from the time of the drug war who left their homes and then piled into these cities. Many of those went to Venezuela, and then of course they come back from Venezuela. Now there are large numbers of Venezuelans and Brazilians who are in Colombia. So Colombia sort of wins the lottery as being the place with the most internally displaced refugees and the most refugees coming from abroad. So This is, as you come into the East Bay Sanctuary, and there she is with Andrew's friend, Peter. He was born in Nebraska, and I think, I'm sorry, here. Oh.
Yeah.
I now think questions. What?
More.
More? Yeah. Oh, I know. I can answer questions about any number of these things because I had a lot more, so much more information about what happened to all of them. Go ahead.
How old was your son when he died?
Her son, well, he was born in 1943 and he died in 73, so he was, I think he was 30, yeah. No, he died in 76. He was 31. And that was a major traumatic event, of course. Because, you know, this is a woman, I think not only her activism is of importance, but as a person who lost all of her family. She lost her aunts, uncles, you know, her husband, and she survived, her mother survived, her father died, her brother survived, but most all the rest of the family either died in the Warsaw Ghetto. Her husband's uncle, Adolf Truskier, the one who was the senator, he insisted on going to the ghetto because he wanted to go with his constituents there and thought that he should get the right to stay out. And so he died, and you know, so then she lost all the family. They come to the United States and have this tiny little family. Mia, Jan, their son Andy, their son Peter, who is our friend, and this horrible mother-in-law, and they live in California, and that's about it. And then later on they found some other relatives who I can talk about, who also came to the United States. And then to lose her son, you know, when he was only 31, he was such an important activist, and it was very, very sad. Yeah.
I don't have a question, but it seems like her life is very difficult. A lot of people I knew anyway, very much parallel some of the things that I know of. My grandparents, they were Rus, part of Poland. They left before the war. Jewish had to get out because they didn't want to go into the Russian conscription for 5 years. And so they came to the United States. I lived through the period you're talking about. I knew this thing. And so what happened there? There's a lot of solidarity. People because people have something political. So I didn't know her. That's all. But we probably walked.
Did you know Sister Maureen? A lot of people.
The name is not familiar, but that's very much involved. It's a little different. And now, city, very
Sure. When your parents came to the Albany area?
No, I've been with my parents, lived in New York City area. I was there up to the first.
Yes?
I was interested in the Lincoln, Nebraska stuff. You know, it said it would have been the early 50s or 49. And I know that, and Willa Cather wrote a lot about, I think, Czechs in Nebraska then,
Yeah.
at the same thing. Were there a lot of Poles in Nebraska after the 50s?
I don't know. She didn't say that there were. She said that they were there for about 4 years, and she said that there were, in Lincoln, you know, there were a lot of people from the university, and they lived in a house with someone who worked for the University of Nebraska Press. and so that she got to know various people there. It was an area of probably people who came sponsored like she was. They were sponsored by an uncle of Jan's and his wife, who would have been the brother to the mother-in-law. And so that's how they ended up there. There were a lot of Czechs. I grew up in Iowa, and there were a lot of Czechs. And Ukrainians, yeah.
I was wondering how you and Andor met her. How did the story start? How long were you working on the research for this? It looks so well researched.
Well, Andor could talk about, Andor spoke at her memorial service, and his speech is in the book there. I don't know if you want to tell about 9 years
So
ago.
I can't say, because that, you want to buy the book?
No.
Don't forget to sell the book.
Just give us a couple of highlights.
I knew Mia and Jan from the 1966. And I got to know them because I was with Kelsey in Long Beach, and Long Beach was very much involved in the movement. Student about coordinating committee, and the guy who became my father-in-law, who was there, and that gave me entry to this older, left liberal community. And Jan and Mia were important parts of that. Plus, Jan and Mia were very close to my in-laws. So I saw them and I knew them quite a bit. And knew their house and so forth, and got to know their son. Peter must be
51.
so he's 40 or something. So then I got to know Peter very well, and he was in our high school SDS that we organized. So that was sort of a connection with it. And a lot of it was not directly political, but part of it was something that you with history. And then later it kept touch, and Teresa got to know us. The rest of the book.
A part of the book that I haven't gone into here has to do with the letters that Mia's mother, who stayed in Warsaw, as I said, throughout the war, she wrote to Mia. And Mia kept all of the letters. So she was able to send the mail. She sent in letters through a cousin of theirs who was in Milan, and that cousin would then send them on to Mia, who was in Rome. In these letters, which are tiny script, I mean, they're just in that kind of very, what do you call that, onion skin paper, and very, very tiny writing. And I hired a translator, several translators who worked on these. And these were letters that were written in code that would tell about what she was doing. So she would say, the Mrs. Stretchia, or something, the word meant roof, has lost the roof, and it crashed or something like that, and that meant that they had probably died or gone to the ghetto. So she was constantly using this, they had this kind of code worked out, and Mia was remembering that as she worked with these translators. The other thing was that her husband, Paulina's husband, and Mia's father, and her brother were in Archangel. And they were clear up by the White Sea, way far up in these work camps, which were pretty desperate places, although that is where the majority of Polish Jews survived, who were those who ended up in those camps, because they stayed there until the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, and then they were released from that camp, and they were moved then to Kazakhstan, to all different places, to Persia, to Lebanon, some of them just all over the place. And so they wrote letters, and so they wrote letters to intermediaries who were in parts of Poland, and then they would pass those on to Paulina, who would get them in Warsaw, and then they would be passed on to Mia. So there was this whole kind of network of mail. And mail got through. It was, probably mail got through with us, I don't know. The mail got through all these different places, and people were able to save a lot of these letters and describe the camps there in the Soviet Union. Yeah.
Just one more question. You mentioned before, you might talk a little bit about what Mia thought about Zionism.
Yeah. I have maybe I should have found the card. She was not a Zionist. And in different places, she talked about Zionism. The first was when she was growing up in Warsaw, and that was quite funny in some ways. She told the story of being a Jew in a majority, most everybody else in her high school, which was a public high school, it was called a municipal school, but it was a kind of selective high school. And they had schools for girls and schools for boys. And so she was in this one municipal high school, which was very good, and she graduated at the top of her class, which is why she was so incensed that she didn't get into the university. In this, they had mandatory religious instruction. And most all of the people in the school were Catholic. There are very few Protestants in Poland about that time. Protestantism was never caught on there like it did in Germany or other places. So people were mostly Jews or Catholic. And so because they had this mandatory religious instruction, they would bring in a rabbi to talk to, give them religious instruction on every Friday. And for some reason they brought, I don't know, this rabbi who was a Zionist, and he was quite conservative. And so he was talking to these young women who were in this very cosmopolitan milieu about how they should go to Palestine, they should go to the country and work on the farms, and they should raise children. And Mia this was probably the worst kind of, evangelizing anybody ever tried to do. Because she said, this is crazy. We just thought they were nuts. Why would I want to go live in the country, someplace I didn't know anything about, and raise children? And, this was not a life I wanted. She wanted to be a professional. So did most of the other, girls that she was with. So her first introduction to Zionism was not successful at all. It was completely did the opposite. She didn't know anybody in Poland. She said she knew a family, and there were a couple of the boys, and they maybe went to Palestine. So she did not run in that circle, and her view of it was, because she's a teenager, her view was just, she liked ice skating and dressing up and going to parties, and she was a very good student. She had no time for the particular Zionist movement, which was prevalent in Warsaw at that time. Then later on, I would say the thing about Mia, which sometimes I know in talking to people that they find rather incredulous, she didn't really think about being Jewish. She saw herself as Polish. She knew that there was no religion in her family. Her parents were not religious. She had never gone to temple, so she didn't really have any pull toward it, and she didn't see Zionism. She said, I think afterwards she thought the Jews had to have a place, and she understood that in the post-war period, but she didn't relate to it at all. And when she talked about the conditions now, she was appalled. She said she could not, she did not tolerate at all the confinement of the Palestinians. She thought that it was horrible the way that people were treated. She likened it to being ghettoized in Poland, and she was not at all. She was not drawn to it at all, and she thought it was a terrible thing. If I find it, quote, I'll tell you exactly what she said. But it's kind of interesting because her children too, and they grew up in California. Long Beach, you know, they're mostly interested in all the things that are going on and growing up in the suburbs of Long Beach. And with this grandmother, who they thought was, you know, the grandmother did hold firm to her Polish aristocratic background. She didn't have to hold to her Jewish background. She was angry. She warned the parents that their son Andy, born in, he was in high school in the 60s, she said when he was going out with girls, he said, you know, you should be careful about who he goes out with, because they just want our money and our name. And the family just thought this was ridiculous, you know. I mean, nobody cared about the Truskier name, and they didn't have any money anymore. So, you know, what was it? But she lived in this past, the aristocratic Poland, and that was all that she was interested in. But they didn't practice Judaism, and they became involved in politics through the Unitarian Church. They had a particularly liberal and left Unitarian church in Long Beach, and it was very involved in the anti-war movement, and it was also one of the first campaigns they became involved in was the fair housing, which was a very big issue in California, where they tried to, they passed a law. The real estate agencies were very much lobbying to, you know, have laws that this government was trying to overturn. And so they became very involved in this action of fair housing, where people would go to houses and they would pretend that they were going to buy it, and then they would say, oh yeah, they were going to buy it. Whites would go, and then afterward a black couple would come, and then the house would no longer be for sale, and so they were using this to try to build the case against it. For doing this, and then for putting a sign on their lawn in Long Beach. I lived in Belmont Shore. It was it's a very prosperous area of Long Beach, very white, and they had eggs thrown at her car, and then the woman next door got very angry about them having this sign, and the neighbors were all after them. So they were always kind of bucking the trend there, and all kinds of things.
They also supported the American Indians.
Oh yeah.
And Mia and Young both got directly involved in defense of some AIM folks who were under oppression. So, you know, their activism that they engaged, and there's a refugee thing, so they amplify, really followed the activism of the 60s or participated in the anti-war stuff, the anti-racist stuff. And like Teresa said, my impression always was that Andy, the older son, died, was really important in pressing his parents, which is not an unusual thing that happens, pressing his parents to more causes, and in some ways to the left. And then, of course, he passed away, and that was a terrible shock. So they're really interesting people. They're people who changed a lot, developed a lot, learned a lot, and stayed engaged, you know, in social life, which is not, one might think, would not have happened to people who were refugees. I mean, they lived in fascist Italy for how long?
Well, they got there in 40 and they left until the end of the war.
Fascist and post-fascist. They lived in a hotel in Rome that was frequented by the SS.
SS officers ate there.
Yeah.
They just simply went ahead, and when I would have asked me, I said, "Were you afraid?" She said, "Well, who would know?" You know, and you got the sense of a lot of people, you know, sort of passing this way. Her mother owned the building, and then in 40, the Gestapo came around. And the thing that was most dangerous about being Jewish there is that someone would turn you in, because people maybe knew. And so this guy turned her mother in. And so the Gestapo came, and her mother came to meet them, and and the Gestapo guy didn't believe the informer because she was so sophisticated, and she didn't look look Jewish. She had a very stereotypical view of Jews. And Mia found this all very funny. The Germans were so stupid. They thought that all the Poles were Aryan, like, blonde hair, and that all the Jews were dark-haired. But Poland is such a mixture. I mean, it's an incredible mixture of nationalities. So they came there, and they did not believe that Paulina was Jewish. And then they arrested a Polish family that was in the building because they, quote, looked Jewish. Well, they got out of that, I guess. But the whole thing was what the world was like, and also that Poland didn't really have identity papers. They had not had. You had a baptismal certificate if you were Polish, because maybe you were probably Catholic. And then Jews could get some kind of a certificate. But then, when the invasion occurred in September of '39, and the city was, so many buildings were bombed, they lost a whole lot of those credentials. And so then you could go down and buy a credential if you could get 2 people to verify that you were Aryan. And so a lot of people, there's a book, it's a very interesting book called The Hidden Jews of Warsaw by Paulson, and he said that they believe there might have been as many as 80,000 Jews who were living on the Aryan side. Obviously, made much more difficult for men than women, because men would be subject to conscription and they could be stopped, and they could also be identified to the circumcision to whether they were Jewish or not. But for a lot of women, they stayed in Aryan. Okay? Thank you. Now, unfortunately, I will say that the book is here. There's a copy back there, and there's some flyers. When I went to the contract, I did not specify what the book was going to cost, and it's still in hardbound, and it costs the full price. It costs $100. So I think that's outrageous for this. I can get the book at a reduced price. And I have my cards there. If you want to send me an email, I could probably get a copy of the book, but not for anything less than probably $50.
Although it is in.
And there is an e-book.
E-book.
Yeah, and that would be available, and that's also on the leaflet there.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
And it should come out in paperback and be much more accessible. So I'll come back and
It's the New York Times.
do.
Thank you.
do